He pointed at the rusted old Ford and laughed loudly. "Beat me in that rust bucket and my Ferrari is yours." The wealthy crowd mocked the elderly black man in worn clothes. None of them knew they were humiliating the wrong person. The Ashworth estate gleamed like a palace against the Connecticut twilight. Crystal chandeliers imported from Vienna cast their golden light across manicured gardens, while uniformed servers circulated with trays of champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a day. The most influential families of Greenwich had gathered to celebrate Brandon Ashworth III's 32nd birthday, and every guest understood the unspoken rules of such evenings. Smile graciously, compliment excessively, and never acknowledge the invisible army of workers who made it all possible. Joseph Beaumont parked his faded blue Ford Country Squire in the farthest corner of the circular driveway, where the shadows of an ancient oak tree might hide its rusted panels and peeling paint from the parade of Bentleys and Porsches. At 71 years old, he had worked as the estate's groundskeeper for nearly 12 years, tending every flower bed and trimming every hedge with the same care he would give his own garden. Tonight, however, he had been summoned for an emergency. The elaborate fountain in the rear garden had stopped working just hours before the party, and Mr. Ashworth Sr. had demanded it be fixed immediately. Joe stepped out of his car slowly, his weathered hands gripping a toolbox that had seen better days. His khaki work pants were clean but faded, his beige shirt pressed but worn thin at the elbows. White hair crowned his dark skin like cotton against mahogany, and deep lines around his eyes told stories of 7 decades spent under the sun. He tucked a yellow cloth into his back pocket out of habit, the same habit he had carried since his younger days, when grease and oil were constant companions. Before closing the car door, he ran his palm across the cracked dashboard with genuine tenderness. This old Ford had history. It had memories woven into every torn seat cushion. His father had given it to him as a wedding present 48 years ago, and it had carried his family through floods, cross-country moves, and countless Sunday drives to church. It was more than transportation. It was a faithful companion that had never once left him stranded. "Mr. Joe," called Patricia, the head housekeeper, hurrying toward him with her black dress swishing against her ankles. "Thank goodness you came so quickly. The fountain went completely dead and Mr. Brandon is having a fit. He says it's ruining the entire aesthetic of his party. Don't worry, Miss Patricia. Probably just a clogged pump or a loose wire. I'll have it running in no time. I certainly hope so. You know how he gets when things don't go his way. And tonight, with all that champagne in him, he's worse than ever." Joe nodded silently and made his way along the edge of the celebration, trying to remain invisible as he always did at these gatherings. He knew this world of hollow appearances all too well, where people like him existed only when something broke. He passed clusters of animated guests who never glanced his direction, as if he were merely another piece of the expensive decor. Women in designer gowns discussed their recent trips to Monaco. Men with Swiss watches worth small fortunes debated stock portfolios and yacht specifications. None of them knew his name, though he had manicured these grounds with devotion for over a decade. That was when everything changed. Brandon Ashworth III stood at the center of an admiring circle near the main terrace, proudly displaying his newest acquisition. A Ferrari 488 Spider gleamed under the party lights like a $500,000 jewel, its crimson paint reflecting the envy of everyone who gathered close. The birthday heir basked in every moment of attention, his blue tuxedo perfectly tailored, his smile perfectly practiced. "Birthday gift from Dad," he announced, raising a champagne flute that sloshed with each dramatic gesture. 460 horsepower of pure Italian excellence. Nothing on these roads can touch her. The guests applauded and whistled their approval. Women in evening gowns posed against the hood for photographs, while men in dinner jackets pretended to understand the engineering specifications Brandon rattled off with rehearsed expertise. It was the perfect theater of wealth and privilege, everyone playing their assigned roles. Joe attempted to slip past unnoticed, circling around the crowd toward the rear garden, but fate had different plans for this particular evening. "Hold on! Hold on!" Brandon's sharp voice sliced through the murmur of conversation like a blade. "What in God's name is that I saw in my driveway?" Every head turned toward where he pointed with an accusatory finger. There, partially concealed by the oak tree's shadow, sat Joe's Ford Country Squire. The rust-spotted panels, the clouded headlights, the faded paint that might once have been royal blue. An absurd contrast against the polished luxury vehicles surrounding it. Whose pathetic heap of junk is that? Brandon demanded loudly, already striding toward the offending vehicle with a cruel smile spreading across his face. Joe felt his stomach turn to ice. He considered stepping back, pretending he had nothing to do with the car, but Patricia spoke before he could retreat. "That belongs to Mr. Joe, sir, the groundskeeper. You asked him to come fix the fountain urgently." Brandon's eyes lit up with a predatory gleam that Joe recognized immediately. He had seen that same look in certain employers throughout his life, that sick pleasure some people derived from publicly degrading those who could not fight back. "The groundskeeper?" Brandon laughed loudly, approaching Joe with exaggerated disbelief. "You actually drove that pile of rust onto my property? Among my guests' automobiles?" "I apologize, Mr. Brandon. I parked as far away as possible, figured it wouldn't bother anyone tucked back there." "Wouldn't bother anyone?" the young heir repeated mockingly, glancing at the crowd that now formed a curious audience. "That thing is a visual assault. It looks like it escaped from a scrapyard." Scattered laughter rippled through the gathering. Several guests shook their heads in feigned disapproval. Others discreetly aimed their phone cameras at the unfolding scene, anticipating content worth sharing. "It's the car I have, sir," Joe replied quietly, maintaining his composure despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "Been reliable for many years. Never failed me once." "Reliable?" Brandon stepped closer, invading the old man's space, his breath heavy with expensive champagne. "This thing shouldn't even be legal on public roads. It's a hazard, an embarrassment on wheels." Grace Ashworth, Brandon's younger sister, pushed through the crowd with obvious discomfort on her face. At 28, she had always been the reasonable one in a family defined by excess and entitlement. "Brandon, leave him alone. He came to work, not to attend your party. Stay out of this, Grace." Brandon dismissed her without a glance, his attention fixed on his target. "I'm just having a little conversation with our groundskeeper here." "You're embarrassing yourself," she insisted. "And you're embarrassing our family. The only embarrassment here is this decrepit vehicle staining my birthday celebration." Brandon turned back to Joe with theatrical outrage. "Do you know how much my Ferrari cost? Do you have any idea?" "I wouldn't know, sir." "Of course you wouldn't. People like you never do." Brandon paused and something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "You know what would be absolutely hilarious?" A few guests exchanged uncertain glances. Some shifted uncomfortably, sensing the situation escalating beyond harmless teasing. But no one intervened. No one ever did. "A race," Brandon announced, spreading his arms wide as if unveiling a grand spectacle. "My Ferrari against your miserable rust bucket. What do you say, old man?" The suggestion drew gasps and nervous laughter from the crowd. It was absurd, ridiculous, the kind of proposition that could only come from someone too privileged to understand how cruel it sounded. "Brandon, stop this nonsense immediately," Grace demanded, her cheeks flushing with shame. "No, listen." He climbed onto the hood of his Ferrari, using it as a stage. "If this old-timer can beat me to the main gate and back, 5 miles total, I'll give him my car. This beautiful Ferrari, signed over on the spot." The audience erupted in excited murmurs. Phones rose higher, recording every moment. "And if he loses," someone called from the crowd. "If he loses, he drives that piece of garbage off my property tonight and never shows his face here again. Fired on the spot." Joe stood motionless, his weathered face betraying nothing of the storm inside him. 71 years of life, 49 years of honest labor, and here he was being mocked publicly by a boy who had never worked a single day for anything he possessed. "Mr. Brandon, I have no interest in your Ferrari," Joe said calmly. "I just came to fix your fountain and go home to my wife." "Scared?" Brandon taunted, jumping down from the hood. "The old man's scared he'll lose." "It's not fear, sir. It's common sense. I have nothing to prove to anyone." "Nothing to prove?" Brandon laughed harshly. "People like you always have something to prove. That's why you spend your whole lives trimming hedges and fixing toilets for people like me." The words struck Joe like a physical blow. 71 years of dignity, 49 years of providing for his family through honest work, and this arrogant child reduced it all to nothing with a single sentence. Something shifted in Joe's dark eyes. "All right, mister." "Brandon," he said, his voice surprisingly steady and clear, "I'll accept your challenge." The garden erupted in cheers and applause. Brandon jumped with excitement, unable to believe his luck. He accepted. The old man actually accepted. "But I have one condition," Joe continued, silencing the noise. Brandon's smile faltered slightly. "What condition?" When I win, besides the car that I don't want, you will apologize to me, in front of all these people. A sincere apology, looking directly into my eyes. The silence that followed was absolute. No one had expected such audacity from the elderly groundskeeper. Brandon recovered quickly, his arrogant grin returning. An apology? You want me to apologize to a gardener? That's my condition. Take it or leave it. Deal! Brandon thrust out his hand dismissively. This will be the most humiliating night of your miserable life, old man. Joe shook the offered hand firmly, never breaking eye contact. I've been prepared for anything life throws at me, Mr. Brandon. The road taught me that lesson a long time ago. Grace approached Joe as he walked toward his Ford. Mr. Joe, you don't have to do this. My brother is drunk and cruel, but this is madness. I know, Miss Grace, but sometimes a man needs to show the world who he really is. That Ferrari has over 400 horsepower. Joe smiled softly, a knowing expression crossing his weathered features. Horsepower isn't everything, young lady. Sometimes what matters most is who's holding the wheel. He climbed into the Ford and turned the ignition. The engine coughed to life, sputtering and wheezing like an elderly man clearing his throat after a long sleep. Patricia positioned herself at the makeshift starting line, a white napkin clutched in her trembling hand. The Ferrari roared like an awakened beast, its engine a symphony of Italian engineering. The Ford wheezed and rattled, seemingly held together by rust and stubbornness. Grace covered her eyes, unable to watch what she believed would be a brutal humiliation. Brandon revved his engine with absolute confidence, already composing the story he would tell for years to come. And Joseph Beaumont sat perfectly still behind his cracked steering wheel, hands steady, breathing calm, a strange light flickering in his eyes that no one present could recognize. It was not the light of fear. It was the light of a man who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. The white napkin rose slowly into the evening air. Both engines screamed in anticipation. Every heart in that crowd stopped beating for one suspended moment. The napkin fell, and what happened next would become the story that none of them would ever forget for as long as they lived. The white napkin touched the ground, and both vehicles exploded forward into the darkness. Brandon's Ferrari launched like a rocket, tires screaming against the pavement as 460 horses propelled him into the night. Within seconds, he was already 50 yards ahead of the Ford, the crimson taillights shrinking rapidly as he accelerated toward the main gate. The smell of burning rubber hung in the air, mixing with the expensive perfumes of guests who rushed toward their own cars to follow the spectacle. Joseph Beaumont did not floor his accelerator. He did not attempt to match the Ferrari's explosive start. Instead, he drove with measured precision, his weathered hands steady on the wheel, his eyes reading the familiar road ahead with the concentration of a man who understood something the cheering crowd did not. "He's already lost!" someone shouted from behind, their voice carrying traces of both amusement and pity. "Poor old fool," another guest muttered, climbing into a Mercedes to chase the action. What was he thinking? Grace had jumped into her friend Caroline's Porsche Cayenne, her heart pounding with anxiety as they followed the race. Through the windshield, she watched her brother's Ferrari disappearing around the first curve, while Joe's Ford puttered along at what seemed like a leisurely pace far behind. "This is cruel," Grace whispered. "Brandon is absolutely cruel." "Your brother has always been cruel," Caroline replied matter-of-factly. "This is just the first time he's doing it in front of witnesses who might actually care." The road to the main gate wound through the estate's property for exactly 2.5 miles before reaching the massive iron entrance. Racers would need to circle the old stone fountain that marked the turnaround point, then navigate the same path back to the house. 5 miles total, with 3 sharp curves and 1 significant hill that tested even modern vehicles. Brandon reached the gate in under 2 minutes. He executed a dramatic spinning turn around the fountain, tires squealing in protest, nearly clipping the stone basin. The Ferrari whipped past and began its return journey. He glanced in his rearview mirror, expecting to see Joe's headlights struggling somewhere behind, but the road was completely dark. "Where is he?" Brandon muttered, confused. "Did the old heap break down already?" He laughed to himself and pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to return victorious and claim his moment of triumph. The engine howled as the Ferrari devoured the winding road, approaching the sharpest curve of the route, the one that descended into a small valley before climbing back toward the mansion. That was when the impossible happened. 2 yellow headlights appeared beside him, not behind, beside. Brandon's head snapped left and his heart nearly stopped. The blue Ford was running parallel to his Ferrari, somehow matching his speed on the inside of the curve. Through the open window, he caught a glimpse of Joseph Beaumont's face, calm as still water, his hands moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost choreographed. "What the hell?" Brandon screamed, jerking his wheel instinctively. The Ferrari wobbled, losing precious traction on the curve's apex. Meanwhile, the Ford held its line with surgical precision, hugging the inside edge as if the vehicle knew exactly where each inch of road belonged. The old car's engine sound had transformed completely. Gone was the asthmatic coughing and wheezing. In its place rose a deep, powerful growl that resonated through the night air like distant thunder. Joe downshifted with perfect timing, and the Ford surged ahead. Brandon watched in disbelief as the rusted station wagon pulled in front of him, its taillights growing smaller, despite his foot pressing the accelerator to the floor. "No, no, no!" He slammed his palm against the steering wheel. "This is impossible!" The guests following in their luxury vehicles witnessed everything unfold. Phones pressed against windows captured footage that would circulate through social media for weeks. A 71-year-old groundskeeper in a rusted Ford was actually racing ahead of a brand-new Ferrari. Grace leaned forward in her seat, her mouth hanging open. "Caroline, are you seeing this?" "I'm seeing it, but I'm not believing it." The hill section approached, the steepest part of the route where horsepower typically dominated. Brandon knew this was his chance. His Ferrari was designed for exactly this kind of challenge. He pressed the sport mode button and felt the engine respond with renewed aggression. But Joe had already anticipated the move. The Ford attacked the incline at an angle that maximized momentum, its modified suspension absorbing the uneven terrain with ease. Wheels that looked ancient gripped the road surface as if welded to it. The engine, whatever modifications had been made over decades of careful attention, delivered power that defied the vehicle's appearance. Brandon gained some ground on the hill, pulling within 2 car lengths of the Ford. His confidence surged. Just a little more, and he would overtake on the final stretch. Then the road leveled out, and Joseph Beaumont demonstrated why horsepower was not everything. The final curve before the mansion required a delicate balance of braking and acceleration. Too much speed entering the turn meant losing control. Too little meant sacrificing precious seconds. It was a technical challenge that separated skilled drivers from mere fast ones. Brandon entered the curve aggressively, trusting his Ferrari's advanced traction control to compensate for his rough technique. The car's computer systems worked overtime, making micro-adjustments to prevent the spin his inputs would have otherwise caused. Joe entered the same curve with his body leaning slightly, weight shifting in perfect harmony with the vehicle's movement. No computer assisted him. No electronic system intervened. Just 71 years of experience and hands that remembered movements practiced thousands of times across thousands of miles. The Ford emerged from the curve 3 full seconds ahead. When the mansion's lights came into view, guests who had remained behind began pointing and shouting. They had expected to see a red blur leading the return, followed eventually by a sputtering antique. Instead, yellow headlights pierced the darkness first, growing larger and brighter with each passing moment. Is that the Ford?" Patricia stammered, clutching her napkin. "It can't be," an older gentleman replied. "There must be some mistake." But there was no mistake. Joseph Beaumont's Ford Country Squire crossed the improvised finish line with the grace of a dancer completing a final bow. The engine settled into a satisfied purr as Joe brought the vehicle to a gentle stop exactly where he had started. 7 seconds later, the Ferrari screamed across the same line. The silence that descended upon the Ashworth estate was unlike anything those manicured gardens had ever witnessed. 123 guests stood frozen in collective disbelief. Phones remained raised, but hands had stopped recording. Champagne glasses hung suspended halfway to open mouths. Joe turned off his engine and stepped out of the car with the same unhurried calm he had displayed before the race. He walked to where Patricia stood trembling, still clutching her napkin flag. "I believe I won, Miss Patricia," he said simply. The housekeeper could only nod, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Brandon erupted from his Ferrari like a man possessed. His face had turned crimson, matching the color of his humiliated pride. "You cheated!" he screamed, storming toward Joe. "There's no way that piece of garbage beat my car. You took a shortcut." "There is no shortcut on this road, Mr. Brandon," Joe replied evenly. "You designed the route yourself this very evening." "Then you did something to that engine. It's not legal. That's fraud." Guests began to gather closer now, their shock transforming into morbid curiosity. Several still recorded with their phones, sensing that the drama was far from finished. "You are welcome to inspect my engine, sir." Joe walked to the rear of his Ford and lifted the hood with practiced ease. "It is the same engine that has been in this car for over 40 years. Brandon pushed through the forming crowd and stared at the mechanical assembly before him. The engine block was indeed old, clearly original to the vehicle. But surrounding it were modifications he could not comprehend, components he had never seen, adjustments that made no sense to his untrained eyes. "What is all this?" he demanded, pointing at unfamiliar parts. "My life's work," Joe answered quietly. "Every Sunday morning for 35 years, while my wife Ruth attends church, I come to my garage and tend to this engine. Adjustments here, improvements there. Nothing illegal, just dedication." Grace pushed her way through the crowd and stood beside the old groundskeeper, studying his face with new eyes. "Mr. Joe," she said softly, "how did you learn to drive like that? That wasn't ordinary driving. That was something else entirely." The question hung in the air like morning fog. Conversations ceased. Even Brandon stopped his ranting to listen. Joe remained silent for a long moment. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, the same faces that had laughed at his car, that had watched his humiliation with entertainment rather than empathy. Then his gaze settled on Brandon, the young man who had inherited everything and earned nothing. "I suppose the truth wants to come out tonight," Joe said finally, his voice carrying a weight that commanded attention. "I was not always a groundskeeper, Miss Grace. That career came later after the world decided I no longer had value." He paused, gathering memories buried for decades. "In the 1960s and 70s, I was a professional racing driver. Stock car circuits throughout the South and Midwest. They called me Smokey Joe because of the way I could make any car move like it was floating on clouds." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several older guests exchanged glances of dawning recognition. "I won 117 races over 14 seasons," Joe continued. 3 regional championships, set track records at 14 different circuits, some of which still stand today. An elderly man near the back of the crowd stepped forward. He wore an expensive suit and carried himself with the bearing of old money and older connections. Judge Richard Coleman had attended the Ashworth family's events for over 30 years, but tonight his face showed an expression no one had ever seen. "Good Lord," he breathed, moving closer to Joe. "I know who you are. I watched you race at Thompson Speedway when I was in law school. You were magnificent." Joe nodded slowly. "That was a lifetime ago, Judge Coleman." "But what happened?" Grace asked. The question everyone wanted answered. "Why did you stop racing? Why did you become—" She trailed off, suddenly aware that finishing her sentence might sound insulting. "Why did I become a gardener?" Joe completed her thought without offense. "That is a longer story, Miss Grace, a sadder story. One involving promises broken by powerful people and doors closed by those who could not accept a black man succeeding in their sport." Brandon had gone pale. His earlier rage had dissolved into something else, something that might have been the beginning of comprehension. "My father gave me this car when I married Ruth 48 years ago," Joe said, patting the Ford's faded hood with affection. "I turned it into a racing vehicle with my own hands, back when I still believed the world would let me compete fairly. When that dream died, I kept the car, kept working on it, kept that part of myself alive, even when everything else was taken away." The crowd stood in absolute stillness. The party had been completely forgotten, champagne warmed in abandoned glasses, a birthday cake waited uncut in the kitchen. None of it mattered anymore. "Tonight," Joe said, turning to face Brandon directly, "I did not race to humiliate you, Mr. Brandon. I raced because you gave me no choice. You backed a man into a corner and expected him to surrender. But I have faced far worse corners than this, and I am still standing." Brandon's mouth opened, but no words emerged. Joe took a slow breath and straightened his worn shirt. "Now, young man, I believe we had an agreement. You owe me something that cannot be purchased with your father's money." Every eye in that crowd turned to Brandon Ashworth III. The heir to a fortune stood paralyzed, stripped of his arrogance, exposed before the very people he had spent his life trying to impress. And for the first time since childhood, he had absolutely no idea what to do. Brandon Ashworth III had never apologized to anyone in his 32 years of existence. He had grown up surrounded by servants who lowered their eyes, teachers who curved his grades, and women who tolerated his arrogance for access to his family's wealth. The world had always bent to accommodate his whims, but now, standing before a crowd of 123 witnesses, with phone cameras capturing every micro-expression on his face, he found himself in completely unfamiliar territory. "Well?" Joe prompted gently, his voice carrying no malice. "We had an agreement, Mr. Brandon." The young heir's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists. Every instinct screamed at him to deflect, to attack, to find some escape from this unbearable moment. His eyes darted through the crowd, searching for an ally, a distraction, anything. No rescue came. Grace stepped closer to her brother, her expression mixing disappointment with something that might have been hope. "Brandon, just do it. For once in your life, do the right thing." "I stay out of this, Grace," he hissed through clenched teeth. "No, I've stayed out of things my whole life, watched you treat people like garbage, and said nothing because it was easier. Not tonight." Her voice cracked slightly. "Tonight I'm asking you to be the brother I always hoped you could be." The words struck Brandon in a place he had forgotten existed. He looked at his younger sister, really looked at her, and saw something he had never noticed before. Pain. Years of accumulated pain from watching someone she loved become someone she could not respect. Judge Coleman cleared his throat and addressed the crowd with the authority of a man accustomed to commanding courtrooms. "I think we all witnessed a fair competition tonight," Mr. Beaumont won decisively. "Honor demands that debts be paid." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. Several guests nodded solemnly. The social pressure mounted with each passing second. Brandon's father, Edward Ashworth II, emerged from the mansion's main entrance. He had been watching the entire spectacle from his study window, and his face bore an expression his son had never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, something worse. Shame. "Son," Edward said quietly, stopping beside Brandon, "there are moments that define a man. This is one of them. Choose wisely." The patriarch retreated without another word, leaving his heir alone with the weight of expectations he had never been required to meet. Brandon turned back to Joe. The old groundskeeper stood patiently, hands clasped in front of him, waiting with the calm demeanor of someone who had learned long ago that rushing rarely improved outcomes. There was no triumph in his posture, no gloating satisfaction in his eyes, just quiet dignity, and somehow that made everything harder. Brandon started, then stopped, his throat constricted around words that felt foreign on his tongue. "I don't—" "Take your time, young man," Joe said softly. "Apologies shouldn't be rushed. They need to come from somewhere real, or they don't mean anything at all." The kindness in Joe's voice was unexpected. Brandon had braced himself for mockery, for revenge, for the same cruelty he would have shown if positions were reversed. Instead, he received patience and grace. Something cracked inside him. "Mr. Beaumont," Brandon began again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I apologize." "For what exactly?" Joe asked, not unkindly. "Specifics matter." Brandon swallowed hard. The crowd leaned in, straining to hear every word. "For humiliating you in front of all these people. For mocking your car, your work, your dignity." The words came faster now, as if a dam had broken. "For treating you like you were invisible every single day you worked here. For assuming I knew anything about you, based on the clothes you wear, or the vehicle you drive." Tears welled unexpectedly in Brandon's eyes. He blinked rapidly, fighting to maintain composure, but a single drop escaped and traced a path down his cheek. "And I'm sorry," he continued, his voice breaking, "for being the kind of person who does these things, for being so empty inside that I need to make others feel small just to feel big myself." The confession hung in the night air like a released breath. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the crickets seemed to pause their evening chorus. Joe studied the young man before him, saw the trembling shoulders, the glistening eyes, the complete dissolution of the arrogant mask that had defined Brandon Ashworth III for 3 decades, and in that vulnerability, Joe recognized something precious, the first fragile sprout of genuine change. "Apology accepted, Mr. Brandon," Joe said, extending his hand. Brandon stared at the offered hand, at the calloused palm and weathered fingers that had spent a lifetime working, while his own hands had done nothing but take. He reached out slowly, almost reverently, and grasped it. The handshake lasted longer than either expected. When they finally separated, something had shifted in the space between them. Grace burst into tears and threw her arms around Joe, startling him with the sudden embrace. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not destroying him when you had every right to." "Destroying people has never interested me, Miss Grace," Joe replied gently, patting her shoulder. "Building them up is far more rewarding." The crowd began to applaud. Not the mocking, anticipatory applause of earlier, but something genuine and warm. Several guests wiped their eyes. Others nodded with newfound respect for the elderly groundskeeper who had shown more class in victory than they displayed in their everyday lives. Judge Coleman approached Joe with visible emotion. "Smoky Joe Beaumont. I never thought I'd see you drive again. That was extraordinary." "Thank you, Judge." It felt good to be behind the wheel for a real run again. "What happened to you after the accident in '79? You disappeared completely. Racing publications speculated for years." The question drew curious looks from everyone within earshot. Even Brandon, still processing his emotional upheaval, turned to listen. Joe sighed deeply, the sound carrying decades of buried pain. "That's a story for another time, Judge. Tonight has already held enough revelations." "Please, Mr. Joe," Grace interjected softly. "I'd like to understand." "We all would." The old man looked around at the faces surrounding him. Wealthy faces, privileged faces, but also human faces capable of compassion when given the opportunity. Perhaps it was time. Perhaps holding on to old wounds only allowed them to fester. "Very well," he said finally, "but not here, not standing in a driveway. If you want to hear the full truth, we do it properly, seated with respect." Patricia stepped forward immediately. "The garden parlor is empty. I can bring chairs, refreshments." Within minutes, a strange procession moved toward the estate's intimate garden parlor. Joe walked at the center, flanked by Grace and Judge Coleman. Brandon followed several steps behind, his birthday celebration entirely forgotten. Other guests trailed after, drawn by curiosity and the undeniable sense that they were witnessing something significant. The garden parlor was a glass-enclosed room overlooking the rose beds Joe had tended for 12 years. Wicker chairs and small tables filled the space, illuminated by soft lantern light. Joe settled into a chair, accepting a glass of water from Patricia with a grateful nod. The others arranged themselves in a semicircle, some sitting, some standing along the walls. Brandon chose a spot in the back corner, partially hidden in shadows. "I was born in Montgomery, Alabama in 1953, Joe began. "My father worked at a garage, fixing cars for white folks who never learned his name. My mother cleaned houses for families who counted the silverware after she left." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. The racial dynamics of the American South were not popular topics in Greenwich society. "I grew up around engines. By the time I was 12, I could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. By 15, I was racing on dirt tracks outside town, competing against men twice my age, and winning." A faint smile crossed his weathered face. They hated that. A black teenager humiliating them on their own tracks. But they couldn't deny my times. Numbers don't care about skin color. Judge Coleman leaned forward, absorbed in the narrative. "I remember reading about you in Racing Weekly. They called you a prodigy." "Some did. Others called me things I won't repeat in mixed company." Joe's smile faded. "By 1970, I had caught the attention of several professional teams. One of them, Hartfield Racing, offered me a contract. It was unprecedented. No major stock car team had ever signed a black driver for their primary circuit." "Hartfield Racing," Grace repeated thoughtfully. "Why does that name sound familiar?" "Because they were eventually acquired by a larger company, then another. Corporate shuffling over the decades, changing names like snakes shedding skin." Joe paused meaningfully. "The company that ultimately absorbed them is called Ashworth Industries." The silence that followed was absolute. Brandon stepped out of his shadowed corner, his face ashen. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the organization which destroyed my career eventually became part of your family's business empire, Mr. Brandon. Though I doubt your father or grandfather ever knew the details, such things get buried deep in corporate archives." "Destroyed your career how?" Grace asked, her voice barely audible. Joe took a long drink of water, gathering himself for the painful part. "In 1975, after I'd won 2 regional championships and was poised to break into the national circuit, Hartfield offered me a new contract. The money was life-changing, enough to secure my family's future for generations." "That sounds positive," Judge Coleman said carefully. "It would have been except for one clause hidden in the fine print." Joe's eyes grew distant, seeing documents decades old. "If I signed, All my previous victories would be officially credited to the team rather than to me personally. My records would be transferred to other drivers. My name would be erased from racing history. Gasps echoed through the parlor. They wanted to profit from my talent while denying my existence, Joe continued. A black champion was good for winning races, but bad for their sponsors in the South. So they offered me money in exchange for my identity. And you refused, Grace said, tears streaming freely now. I refused. Told them my victories were the only thing in this world that truly belonged to me, and no amount of money could buy them. Joe straightened in his chair, pride evident in his bearing. The next week I was blacklisted from every major circuit in the country. Sponsors received anonymous warnings about associating with me. Tracks suddenly had no available slots for my entries. Within 6 months, my racing career was over. Brandon sank into a nearby chair, his legs apparently unable to support him. My family's company did this to you? Your family's company inherited the sins of those who came before, Mr. Brandon. Whether anyone currently at Ashworth Industries knows about it, I cannot say. Joe looked at the young man with surprising compassion. We cannot choose what our ancestors did. We can only choose what we do ourselves. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Generations of injustice, corporate malfeasance, and institutional racism suddenly had a human face. A face that had trimmed their hedges and planted their flowers for 12 years without complaint. What happened after that? Grace asked softly. How did you survive? Joe smiled, and for the first time that evening, genuine warmth reached his eyes. The same way I've survived everything, Miss Grace, with Ruth beside me refusing to let me give up. He reached into his worn wallet and extracted a faded photograph. Ruth Eleanor Beaumont at 23, standing beside a younger Joe in front of a modest church, both beaming with the invincible joy of newlyweds. 48 years ago this autumn, Joe said, gazing at the image. She believed in me when I stopped believing in myself. And she's still believing in me today, waiting at home right now with dinner getting cold. Grace took the photograph gently, studying the faces of two young people whose entire future stretched before them, unaware of the obstacles waiting ahead. She's beautiful, Grace whispered. She still is, Joe replied. Even more so now. Beauty like hers only deepens with time. Brandon remained frozen in his chair, a man drowning in revelations he had never expected to face on his birthday evening. And the night was far from over. The drive to Joe's house took less than 20 minutes, but for Brandon Ashworth III, it felt like crossing into another world. He had insisted on following Joe home, despite his sister's protests and his own uncertainty about why. Something had broken open inside him during the revelations, and he could not simply return to birthday cake and champagne as if nothing had happened. Grace rode beside him in his BMW, while Judge Coleman followed in his own vehicle. They turned off the main highway onto progressively smaller roads until pavement gave way to gravel and streetlights became sparse. The homes grew humbler with each block. Finally, Joe's Ford pulled into the driveway of a modest house with pale yellow siding and a porch that sagged slightly at one corner. But the garden was immaculate. Even in the dim evening light, Brandon could see the careful arrangement of flowers along the walkway, the precisely trimmed hedges, the healthy rose bushes climbing a handmade trellis. This was not mere maintenance. This was love made visible. Joe stepped out of his Ford and looked toward the porch, where a figure sat waiting in a wooden rocking chair. Ruth Eleanor Beaumont rose slowly, her silver hair catching the porch light, her face creased with concern that melted into relief when she saw her husband. Joseph Beaumont, do you have any idea what time it is? She called out, her voice carrying the particular mixture of worry and affection that only 5 decades of marriage could produce. I know, Ruth, I know. There was some unexpected business at the estate. Ruth's eyes moved past her husband to the unfamiliar vehicles parking along their street. When she recognized Brandon stepping out of the BMW, her expression shifted to guarded wariness. That's the Ashworth boy, she said quietly as Joe reached the porch. What's he doing here? It's a long story, sweetheart. A very long story. Grace approached the porch steps with hesitant respect, as if entering sacred ground. Mrs. Beaumont, I'm Grace Ashworth. I'm so sorry to intrude on your evening like this. Ruth studied the young woman carefully, reading her face the way she had learned to read people over 70 years of life. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. You have kind eyes, Ruth said finally. Your brother's eyes are different, troubled. Brandon hung back near the cars, uncertain whether he was welcome to come closer. The confident heir who had commanded attention at his birthday party seemed like a distant memory, replaced by someone who did not know the rules of this unfamiliar territory. "He can come up too," Ruth said, gesturing toward Brandon. "Whatever happened tonight, he looks like he needs to sit down before he falls down." They gathered on the small porch, some sitting on mismatched chairs, others standing against the railing. Patricia had followed as well and busied herself in Ruth's kitchen preparing tea. "So," Ruth said, settling back into her rocker and taking Joe's hand in hers, "are you going to tell me what kind of trouble you found tonight?" Joe recounted the evening's events, from the initial humiliation to the race to the revelations about Hartfield racing. Ruth listened without interruption, her thumb tracing circles on her husband's weathered palm. When he finished, silence held the porch for a long moment. "You raced again," Ruth finally said, her voice soft with emotion. "After all these years, you finally raced again." "I did. And the old Ford still has it, Ruth. Still runs like she did in '74. Ruth's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She turned to look at their visitors, these wealthy strangers who had stumbled into her modest world. "Do you know how many nights I watched this man cry?" she asked, addressing no one in particular. "After they took everything from him, he would sit in that garage until 2, 3 in the morning, working on that car, talking to it like it could hear him." "Ruth," Joe said gently, "they don't need to hear all that." "Yes, they do." Her voice strengthened with conviction. "They need to hear what their world does to people like us, how it chews us up and spits us out, and expects us to smile and say thank you." Brandon flinched visibly at her words. "For 12 years, my husband has trimmed your family's hedges and planted your flowers," Ruth continued, her gaze fixed on Brandon. 12 years of yes, sir, and no, sir, and pretending he didn't notice when people looked right through him. "Mrs. Beaumont, Brandon started. "I'm not finished." Ruth's tone was firm but not cruel. "I watched the videos already. My granddaughter showed me on her phone while I was waiting for Joe to come home. Saw you pointing and laughing. Saw all those fancy people treating my husband like a joke." The shame on Brandon's face deepened with each word. Grace reached over and squeezed his arm, offering silent support. "But I also saw something else," Ruth continued, softening. "I saw you apologize. Saw your face when you realized what you'd done. That's why I let you onto my porch, Mr. Ashworth, because that apology looked real." Brandon met her eyes for the first time. "It was real, Mrs. Beaumont. I've never meant anything more in my life." Ruth studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly. "All right, apology accepted. But accepting an apology and trusting someone are different things. Trust has to be earned, day by day, choice by choice." "I understand." Patricia emerged from the kitchen with tea and cookies she had found in Ruth's pantry. As she distributed cups, Ruth suddenly winced and pressed a hand to her chest. "Ruth?" Joe leaned forward immediately, alarm crossing his features. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, nothing. Just a little flutter. It's been happening on and off today." "On and off? Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have worried and you had work to do." Ruth attempted a dismissive wave, but another wince betrayed her. Joe stood quickly, his concern evident. "How long has this been going on? Tell me the truth." "A few weeks, maybe. I didn't want to make a fuss." "A few weeks?" Joe's voice rose with worry. "Ruth Eleanor Beaumont, we are going to the hospital right now." "Joe, it's probably nothing, just indigestion or—" She stopped mid-sentence, her face suddenly draining of color. Her hand clutched at her chest more urgently, and she slumped forward in her chair. "Ruth!" Joe caught her before she could fall, cradling her against his chest. "Someone call an ambulance. Call 911 now." Brandon already had his phone out, fingers dialing with trembling speed. Grace rushed to help support Ruth while Patricia ran inside to find a pillow. "Stay with me, sweetheart," Joe pleaded, his voice cracking. "Stay with me. Don't you dare leave me now, not after 50 years, not like this." Ruth's eyes fluttered open weakly. "Joe, I'm sorry. I should have told you. Don't apologize, just breathe. Help is coming, just keep breathing." The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes that felt like 8 hours. Paramedics swarmed the small porch, checking vital signs, attaching monitors. "Blood pressure's dropping," one announced. "We need to transport immediately." "I'm coming with her," Joe said, already moving toward the ambulance. "Sir, there's limited space." "I have been beside this woman for 48 years, Joe interrupted, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "I am not leaving her side now." The paramedic looked at Joe's face and simply nodded. "Get in." Brandon stepped forward as they loaded Ruth into the ambulance. "Mr. Beaumont, which hospital? We'll follow you." "Greenwich General. It's the closest. We'll be right behind you, I promise." Joe paused at the ambulance doors, looking back at the young man who hours ago had mocked him publicly. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended their vastly different worlds. "Thank you," Joe said simply, then climbed in beside his wife. The ambulance pulled away with lights flashing, siren piercing the quiet neighborhood. Brandon stood frozen in the driveway, watching until the red lights disappeared around a corner. "Brandon," Grace said softly, touching his shoulder. "We should go." "This is my fault," he whispered. "The stress of tonight, the race, everything I put him through. If something happens to her because of me—" "You don't know that." She said it's been happening for weeks. "But tonight couldn't have helped. The humiliation, the confrontation, all of it." Brandon's voice broke. "What have I done, Grace? What kind of person have I been?" Judge Coleman approached, his expression grave but compassionate. "Self-recrimination won't help anyone right now, son. What will help is being there, showing up, following through." Brandon nodded mechanically and moved toward his car. The drive to the hospital passed in tense silence. Grace watched her brother grip the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Brandon," she finally said, "whatever happens tonight, you can't carry this guilt forever. Maybe I should. Maybe I should carry it for the rest of my life as a reminder of who I was. Guilt doesn't change the past. It only poisons the future." Grace paused thoughtfully. "What changes things is what you do next. How you live from this moment forward." They arrived at Greenwich General and rushed to the emergency department, where they found Joe seated in a plastic chair, his weathered hands clasped together, his lips moving in silent prayer. "Any news?" Brandon asked, sitting beside him. "They're running tests," said her heart rhythm was irregular. "Could be many things, some serious, some manageable." Joe's voice was hollow. "We just have to wait. Is there anything I can do? Anything at all?" Joe looked at the young man sitting beside him in this sterile waiting room. Brandon Ashworth III, heir to a fortune, still wearing his birthday tuxedo, now wrinkled and disheveled. The arrogance was gone completely, replaced by something raw and searching. "Pray if you're the praying type," Joe said. "That's all any of us can do right now." Brandon had not prayed since childhood, since before he learned that money could buy almost anything. But sitting in that fluorescent-lit room, watching an old man face the possible loss of his life's companion, Brandon closed his eyes and tried to remember how. The hours crawled past. Nurses came and went with updates that revealed little. Joe refused coffee, refused food, refused everything except occasional water that Grace pressed into his hands. Near midnight, a doctor in green scrubs emerged through the double doors, her face professionally neutral. "Family of Ruth Beaumont?" Joe stood so quickly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I'm her husband." "Is she all right? Please tell me she's all right." The doctor's expression softened slightly. "She's stable, Mr. Beaumont. We've identified the problem as atrial fibrillation, an irregular heartbeat that's been going untreated for some time. It's serious, but manageable with proper medication and monitoring." Joe's legs seemed to give way beneath him. Brandon caught his arm, steadying him. "She's going to be okay?" Joe asked, his voice barely a whisper. "With proper treatment and some lifestyle adjustments, yes. She'll need to stay overnight for observation, but you can see her now if you'd like." "Yes, please, take me to her." Joe followed the doctor through the doors, leaving Brandon, Grace, and Judge Coleman in the waiting room. The relief in the air was palpable, but something else lingered too. Brandon sank into a chair and buried his face in his hands. "She's going to be okay," Grace said gently. "This time," Brandon replied, his voice muffled. "But for how long? They don't have money for specialists, for the best medications, for follow-up care. Did you see their house, Grace? Did you see how they live?" "I saw it. And my family's company is partly responsible for putting them there. For stealing his career, his future, his chance at financial security." Brandon looked up, his eyes red. "How do I live with that? How do I just go back to my life, knowing what I know now?" Grace sat beside her brother and took his hand, something she had not done since they were children. "Maybe you don't go back to your life," she said quietly. "Maybe you build a different one." Brandon stared at her, and in that moment something fundamental shifted behind his eyes. Not just guilt anymore, not just shame, purpose. 3 weeks had passed since the night that changed everything. Ruth Eleanor Beaumont sat in her favorite rocking chair on the porch, a light blanket across her lap despite the warm sun. The new medication had stabilized her heart rhythm, and color had returned to her cheeks. She watched her husband kneeling in the garden, carefully transplanting marigolds along the walkway. "Joseph Beaumont, you're going to wear yourself out in this heat," she called. "I'm almost done, sweetheart. Just want to get these settled before evening." "You've been saying almost done for an hour now." Joe smiled and brushed the dirt from his knees, walking toward the porch with a marigold bloom in his hand. He tucked it gently behind Ruth's ear, the bright orange petals vivid against her silver hair. "There, now you're the prettiest flower in the whole garden, you old charmer." Ruth laughed softly, the sound like wind chimes on a summer breeze. "After 50 years, you'd think you'd run out of lines." "Never. I've got 50 more years of lines stored up, just waiting." He settled into the chair beside her, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching afternoon shadows lengthen across their modest yard. The blue Ford rested in the driveway, freshly washed, its old paint somehow gleaming with renewed pride. "That reporter called again," Ruth mentioned after a while. "The one from the racing magazine. Wants to do a full feature story. And I told him the same thing I told the others. No interviews, no features, no dragging up the past for entertainment. Maybe you should consider it, Joe. People should know what was done to you, what they stole." Joe took his wife's hand, tracing the familiar lines of her palm. "What they stole long ago. Can't get it back by talking to magazines. Besides, what matters most wasn't stolen. It's sitting right here wearing a marigold in her hair." Ruth squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. "You always know exactly what to say." 50 years of practice. A car turned onto their street, an unfamiliar sedan moving slowly. It stopped in front of their house, and Brandon Ashworth stepped out from the passenger side. Grace emerged from the driver's seat. Joe stood, surprised. He had not seen either of them since that night at the hospital. "Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont," Brandon said, approaching with hesitant steps. He looked different. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by simple khakis and a plain white shirt. Something in his posture had shifted from entitled to uncertain. "Mr. Ashworth," Joe acknowledged. "Miss Grace, this is unexpected." "I hope we're not intruding," Grace said. Brandon asked if we could visit. "He has something he wants to discuss with you both." Ruth gestured toward the empty chairs on the porch. "Sit down then. No sense standing in the sun." Brandon climbed the porch steps and sat across from the elderly couple, his hands clasped nervously between his knees. Grace remained standing near the railing, watching her brother with cautious hope. "First," Brandon began, "I wanted to see that Mrs. Beaumont is recovering well. The hospital visit, that night—" He paused. "I've thought about it every day since." "I'm doing much better, thank you," Ruth replied. "Good medicine and a stubborn husband make a powerful combination." "I'm glad, truly glad." Brandon took a deep breath. "But that's not the only reason I came." He reached into his pocket and withdrew an envelope, setting it on the small table between them. Joe looked at it but made no move to pick it up. "What's this?" Joe asked. "It's the deed to a house," Brandon said quietly. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, fully accessible, in a neighborhood with good hospitals nearby. The property taxes are prepaid for the next 20 years, and there's a fund set up to cover maintenance and utilities. Joe's expression hardened. "I told you before, we don't want charity." "It's not charity, Mr. Beaumont." Brandon leaned forward, his voice earnest. "It's restitution, not nearly enough, but a beginning." "Restitution for what?" "You didn't personally do anything to my career. That happened decades before you were born." "No, but I inherited the benefits. Every dollar my family has, every opportunity I've been given, comes from a company that was built partly on injustice. Your injustice and others like you." Brandon's jaw tightened. "I can't change what happened in the past, but I can choose what I do with what I've inherited." Ruth looked at her husband, reading the stubborn pride on his face. She understood it, but she also recognized something genuine in the young man before them. "Joe," she said softly, "hear him out." Brandon continued. "I've spent 3 weeks going through old company records. What they did to you wasn't isolated. There were others. Black drivers, Latino mechanics, anyone who threatened the established order. Systematically pushed out, blacklisted, erased. I knew there were others," Joe said heavily. "We just never talked about it. Too painful. I'm trying to find them, or their families, for those who have passed. I want to make things right where I can." Brandon paused. "But it started with you, Mr. Beaumont, because you were the one who showed me who I was becoming, and who I could choose to be instead." Grace stepped forward. Brandon resigned from the company 2 weeks ago. He's not taking over for our father anymore. He's walking away from all of it. Joe's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. Walked away from the family business. It was never really mine, Brandon said simply. I just happened to be born into it. That's not the same as earning it. You taught me that. Silence settled over the porch. A cardinal landed on the nearby fence, brilliant red in the afternoon light, then flew away as quickly as it had appeared. The house, Joe said finally. I can't accept it. Brandon's face fell. But, Joe continued, Ruth and I have talked about what we might do if we ever had resources to spare. There's a young man down at the community center, Marcus. 17 years old, works on cars like I used to, dreams of racing professionally. His mother works 3 jobs and they're about to lose their apartment. Ruth nodded, understanding exactly where her husband was going. If you want to make restitution, Joe said, give that house to Marcus and his mother. Let them have the fresh start that was stolen from people like me. Brandon stared at Joe for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. You'd rather help a stranger than take something for yourself? He's not a stranger. He's the next generation, the one who still has time to build a different future. Joe smiled slightly. That's worth more than any house. Grace wiped tears from her cheeks. Brandon simply nodded, unable to speak. There's one more thing, Joe said. He stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking at his garden. I've been thinking about what you said that night, about finding the other drivers who were pushed out. I meant it, Brandon said. I want to find all of them. Then you'll need help. Someone who knows the racing world, who remembers names and faces. Joe turned to face him. I'm 71. Too old to race again, but not too old to remember. And not too old to bear witness. You'd help me? After everything? The Bible says something about forgiveness, young man, about not letting bitterness take root in your heart. Joe walked back to his chair and sat beside Ruth, taking her hand once more. I spent too many years angry about what was taken from me. It didn't bring back a single trophy, didn't restore a single record, just made the weight heavier to carry. Ruth leaned her head against her husband's shoulder. What he's trying to say is that he forgives you, and he's ready to move forward. Brandon's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his face as he buried his head in his hands, overwhelmed by receiving grace he knew he did not deserve. Grace knelt beside her brother, one arm around his shoulders, her own tears falling silently. Joe and Ruth watched, holding hands, understanding that they were witnessing something sacred, a heart breaking open to allow healing in, a life redirecting toward a better path. When Brandon finally composed himself, he looked at Joe with red-rimmed eyes. I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me. Just be better. Every day and every choice. Be better than you were the day before. That's all any of us can do. The afternoon stretched into evening as they talked, about racing history, about family, about dreams deferred and dreams still possible. Patricia arrived with dinner, insisting everyone eat properly. Judge Coleman stopped by with documents from his research into old racing records. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Brandon and Grace prepared to leave. But before stepping off the porch, Brandon turned back one last time. Mr. Beaumont, can I ask you something personal? Go ahead. That night, when you agreed to race me, you were so calm, so confident. Weren't you afraid at all? That you might lose, that the car might fail after all those years? Joe considered the question carefully before answering. I was terrified, he admitted. Not of losing the race, not of being fired. I was terrified that I had forgotten who I was, that all those years of being invisible had made me believe I was actually nobody. He looked at Ruth. But then I remembered something my father told me when I was young. He said your worth isn't determined by how people treat you. It's determined by how you treat yourself, and by the people who love you enough to remind you of the truth when you forget. Ruth lifted their joined hands and kissed his weathered knuckles. I got in that car knowing Ruth believed in me. Knowing the man my father raised was still in there somewhere, that was enough. Joe smiled. It was always enough. Brandon nodded slowly, absorbing the wisdom, like parched earth drinking rain. Thank you, Mr. Beaumont, for everything. Call me Joe, and come back sometime. Ruth makes the best sweet potato pie in Connecticut. I'd like that very much. Joe. The sedan pulled away, disappearing around the corner. Joe and Ruth remained on their porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. You think he'll really change? Ruth asked quietly. I think he already has. The question is whether he'll keep choosing to change every single day, when it gets hard and nobody's watching. And if he doesn't, then at least we planted a seed. That's all we can ever do, Ruth. Plant seeds and trust they'll grow. She nestled closer to him, the marigold still tucked behind her ear, its petals soft against her silver hair. 50 years, she murmured, and you're still teaching people about life. I learned from the best. My father, my mother, and especially from this beautiful woman who chose to spend her life with a stubborn old fool who'd rather work on cars than do anything sensible. That stubborn old fool is the best decision I ever made. They sat together as night settled around them, two people who had weathered storms that would have destroyed lesser loves. No mansion sheltered them, no fortune padded their accounts. Just a modest house, a marigold garden, and a rusted blue Ford that had carried them through 50 years of life. And in that moment, watching the stars wheel overhead, holding the hand of the woman who had never stopped believing in him, Joseph Beaumont understood something that Brandon Ashworth was only beginning to learn. The true measure of a life is not counted in victories or defeats, not in dollars earned or records set, not in the cars we drive or the houses we own. The true measure of a life is counted in the hands that reach for ours in the darkness, in the hearts that choose us again and again through every failure and every triumph, in the quiet moments on a porch at twilight when nothing needs to be said because everything has already been understood, because in the end we do not remember the races we won. We remember who was waiting for us at the finish line. And we remember who held our hand when the race was finally over.